visiting fellow, a program made possible by the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation. One of the foundation's missions is to improve the quality of business journalism around the country, and we feel that giving students and faculty a chance to hear from someone of Gretchen's caliber is a really good way to decades. And some of that criticism is well-deserved. But if you think all reporters were cheerleading throughout the dot-com boom or ignoring the housing bubble, you haven't been reading Gretchen Morgenson. Gretchen's Sunday column and her reporting in the Times daily pages have consistently challenged conventional wisdom and exposed fundamental flaws in standard operating procedures. That hasn't always won her uniform praise. Some people in the business world, and even some in the press, criticize her for being too negative or too strident. One blogger, who rails against her work regularly, refers to her as Gretchen Morgenscreed. Fortunately, Gretchen's reporting has earned her ample respect in other circles. In 1998, she was a member of a team that won the Gerald Loeb Prize for articles on the near collapse of long-term capital management. Remember that? It was a hedge fund whose troubles disrupted world financial markets. And in 2002, Pulitzer jurors cited her trenchant and incisive coverage of Wall Street when they awarded her the prize for beat coverage. And just this June, Nation magazine carried a profile of Gretchen with the headline, "The most important financial journalist of her generation." I think she should just retire now. The author said she combines a blunt writing style with a prodigious fact-gathering ability and an accountability mindset all too rare in the business press culture. This allows her to go beyond merely reporting and commenting on the public agenda. She helps to set it. So where did Gretchen get the expertise and the backbone to do what she does? You might be surprised to hear her career path. I'm happy to report that it started at a small liberal arts college in a rural setting. Gretchen graduated from St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota, with a double major in history and English. She began her career as an assistant at Vogue magazine, although she said the term slave might be more appropriate. And she says the experience was Devil Wears Prada, totally. So by the time she left the magazine in 1981, she had worked her way up to the position of writer and financial columnist. But her next move was an unconventional one. She became a stockbroker for Dean Witter Reynolds in New York. And after 3 years there, she moved to Money magazine and then to Forbes and then to Worth magazine, where she was the executive editor. In 1995, she took another unconventional detour, becoming press secretary for the Steve Forbes for President campaign. When that campaign ended, she went back to the magazine that bears his name as assistant managing editor. Gretchen joined the New York Times staff in May 1998, and for the past 11 years, she has had no shortage of news to chronicle about corporate misdeeds. In yesterday's Times, she had not one but two columns, because there's so much going on in this area. One was on lenders that can't trace exactly who owns your mortgage, and the other was on last week's flurry of activity to create a consumer financial protection agency and to curb executive compensation. Gretchen is also the author and editor of several books, including the recently released Capitalist Bible, The Essential Guide to Free Markets and Why They Matter to You. And she will be signing copies of that book outside this room at the conclusion of her talk. I actually tried to get Gretchen here last fall to talk about what was going on in the financial world, something that she now calls the greatest financial fiasco since the Great Depression. Understandably, she was far too busy at the New York Times covering that fiasco to come. So I'm delighted she's here today to tell us what she saw at the Meltdown. Please join me in welcoming Gretchen Morgenson.
Thank you. Thanks, Pam, and thanks for being persistent. I would never have come to Washington and Lee. It's hard to get here, but boy, once you're here, it's a delightful place. And when Pam contacted me last year, I'm amazed I even got an email back to you. The world was coming to an end, and we were all just running around like crazy in the newsroom trying to make sense of it all, which I'm not sure we really did. But we were trying, and I think that what we quickly found out after the Bear Stearns crisis then became the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac bailout, which morphed into the Lehman failure, which then became the AIG rescue, that we really had to try to step back for our readers to help them to understand why what was happening was happening. And so we produced from, I think, September 25th or so through the end of the year, a series of stories called The Reckoning, which were really an attempt to try to go back and take stock of how we had gotten into this mess, whether it was by analyzing regulatory failures, by looking at lending practices, and that was when Pam emailed me, and I was in the throes of trying to produce a lot of those stories with my colleagues. Well, anybody who has been covering Wall Street for as long as I have, which I'm sorry to say is a very long time, knows that it can be relied upon to give you a wealth of stories, probably full-time for the rest of your life. In fact, having Wall Street as your beat is something that I call the gift that keeps on giving. The best and the brightest minds from the world's top business schools and universities, after all, flock to Wall Street. And these fertile minds are constantly coming up with new ways for companies to raise money and creating exotic instruments for investors to buy and sell. Now, as middleman on all of these transactions, whether or not they make money for the client, Wall Street banks earn a pretty penny. It was always this way. It was ever thus, even back in the early 80s when I myself had a stint on Wall Street. But the material that was thrown at me during our recent financial troubles make all of the previous crises that we've lived through seem like child's play. It really is as yet unknown how many trillions of dollars will wind up being lost in the credit fiasco of 2008. But we can be sure that all of us, and probably all of our children too, will be paying off the bill for this mess for quite some time. So what did I see from my ringside seat at the Meltdown? Well, I saw what happens when regulators don't regulate. And I saw what happens when unfettered risk-taking, with an eye to huge personal paydays, gains the upper hand in executive suites and on Wall Street trading desks. And finally, I saw what happens when Washington decides, in its infinite wisdom, that every living, breathing citizen should own a home. You remember a chicken in every pot. Well, this time it was an owner in every home. Keep in mind on this Washington angle that I'm not singling out one particular party for blame. Both Democrats and Republicans have worked to propel homeownership over the years. And like many government projects, it was based on a noble idea. To understand the roots of this crisis, you have to go back to 1995. When William Jefferson Clinton launched the National Homeownership Strategy, a private-public partnership with one goal, raising home ownership rates across America. Mr. Clinton and his advisors also had wanted to reverse a troubling decline of home ownership that had taken place during the early 90s. And so with home ownership at 64%, he urged private enterprise to join hands with public agencies to ensure that by the year 2000, some 70% of the population would own their own homes. To reach this goal, Mr. Clinton asked bankers, home builders, appraisers, financial services firms, anyone even remotely linked to the home building and financing industry to combine efforts. The resulting partnership was made up of 65 leading national organizations and 131 smaller groups. Of course, the private sector stood to gain handsomely from an increase in homeownership. But nothing as crass as profits came up when the homeownership strategy was launched. Instead, the focus was on the deeply rooted and almost universally held belief that homeownership provides important advantages that merit continued public support. Those benefits included job creation, financial security, and more stable neighborhoods. As Mr. Clinton said in a speech in 1996, when we boost the number of homeowners in our country, we strengthen our economy, create jobs, build up the middle class, and build better citizens. Well, this prediction came true, but only for a while. A little more than a decade after he made that comment, the economy had derailed, jobs were disappearing, and the middle class was imperiled by free-falling home prices and decimated retirement accounts. By 2007, homeownership was no longer the route to a secure spot in middle-class America. For millions of families, homeownership had put them squarely on the road to personal and financial ruin. Fueled by dubious industry practices that went unchecked by regulators, the homeownership drive was a major factor in creating the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Even those who didn't participate in the housing mania are feeling the pain of its aftermath now. Trillions of dollars in taxpayer bailouts designed to prop up some of the financial institutions that prospered as they drove the nation into the ditch are setting the stage for future inflation and a decline in the purchasing power of the American dollar. How this home ownership strategy was born, nurtured, and finally came to almost blow up the American economy is the story of greed and good intentions, corporate corruption, and government support. It's also a story of pretty lies told by politicians, company executives, bankers, regulators, and borrowers. Now, there were those along the way who questioned the merits of the homeownership push. Some investors, for example, tried to alert regulators to the rising tide of mortgage swindlers. They were met with a deafening silence. Consumer lawyers, who saw the poisonous nature of many of these loans, worked to outlaw them. They were beaten back by an army of lenders and lobbyists. And in a particularly ugly moment in 2004, the credit rating agencies, who are supposed to be neutral analysts of the risks in securities that they rate, helped to stop a predatory lending bill that was on its way to passage in the state of Georgia. Standard & Poor's announced that it would no longer rate mortgage securities that included loans issued in Georgia if the Consumer Protection Bill became law. As a result, it was watered down. Some independent thinkers in academia argued for many, renting a home was better than owning. They were refuted by studies using dubious figures to conclude that home ownership was indeed a desired goal for all. All these critics were either willfully ignored or silenced by well-funded, self-interested, and sometimes vicious opposition. Their voices were drowned out by the home ownership machine, a vertically integrated, powerful consortium whose members were driven either by ideology or by the vast profits that rising home ownership would provide. Now, because housing finance is heavily regulated, government participation was vital to the home ownership push. One of the most crucial responses was to allow Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the quasi-government mortgage finance companies, to balloon their balance sheets. These companies played an enormous role in this crisis. Federal regulators also relaxed important rules that dealt with conflicts of interest in the home buying process. One early change involved property appraisers. In the past, the government had required that they be independent from both the real estate agents selling the properties and the mortgage lenders providing funding for the home. Then, working to streamline its operations, the Department of Housing and Urban Development began permitting lenders to select their own appraisers to value properties that the agency would insure. Thus was the stage set for inflated home appraisals, which let lenders lend bigger amounts to borrowers than they could afford or than their houses were truly worth. Bigger loans meant fatter fees and commissions all the way around. Wall Street's contribution, as always, its money machine. Firms like Merrill Lynch, Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns all provided huge lines of credit to mortgage lenders who went out and wrote loans wherever they could. After the loans were made, the firms pooled them into securities that they then divvied up into tranches according to their risk attributes. Then these securities were sold to investors, and the process began all over again. A classic problem with this setup was that it removed any accountability for bad loans that were made. In the securitization process, banks became intermediaries, middlemen, making loans to sell downstream to investors and locking in huge fees when they did. That, in turn, meant that they had no incentive to be prudent in their lending. In the brave new world of structured finance, the time-tested practice of knowing your borrower went straight out the window. Lenders instead were incentivized to make as many loans as they could. If the loan went into default, it was the investor's problem. As you can see, many, many cooks created this toxic subprime stew. And I think that one reason why we have not seen an aggressive investigation into the origins of the financial crisis and the regulatory responses to it is that too many people in Washington recognize that such an inquiry could very well lead straight to their doors. While the taxpayers are in fact owed an investigation in the style of Ferdinand Pecora, the prosecutor in the early 1930s who conducted just such an inquiry after the Great Crash, I am not confident that we will ever get an investigation as vigorous or revealing as his was. It's, of course, too early to get a comprehensive account of what happened before, during, and after the meltdown. We will have to wait for the historians to weigh in for that. But my own perspective begins in late 2006 when I started hearing from investment managers and housing finance experts that residential mortgage securities were full of toxic loans. The bursting of the housing bubble was going to cause enormous upheaval in the markets. It soon became clear. Writing about the aftermath of a boom was nothing new. I had written extensively about the internet bubble, both before and after it burst. But even though the decline of the NASDAQ in 2000 wrecked many, many stock portfolios, that mania did not overflow into the overall economy. The reason that the mortgage mess would be different and so much more damaging to the economy had everything to do with the leverage that it was built upon. As my editor at Forbes used to say, the assets may shrink in value, but the debt doesn't. People learned the hard way that when you use borrowed money to buy an inflated asset, you get into big trouble when the value of that asset falls. This was not the case only for American homeowners who used their homes as ATM machines, but it was also true for banks and brokerage firms that loaded up on leverage to conduct their trading businesses. Many of them borrowed 30-to-1 on the value of their assets, and when those assets began to go south, that leverage meant death. And so we saw the rescue of Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers that was a direct result for this excessive use of leverage. So why did seemingly intelligent, shrewd managers of financial firms lever up their balance sheets so dangerously? The profits to be made, in the short term anyway, were simply enormous. In 2003, Alan Greenspan's Federal Reserve dropped interest rates to 1% and kept them there far longer than was necessary. This made money way too cheap, and it made all too inviting the allure of borrowing to invest in assets that generated far higher interest rates than were associated with the cost of the money borrowed. So began a mind-boggling debt binge that we are still in the painful process of unwinding. Many of the securities that were purchased using low-cost money were mortgages. Couched in the goal of increasing home ownership, complex mortgage loans that were far different from the tried and true fixed-rate versions that home buyers had known were peddled and sold to investors. Lenders called these loans affordability products, and while they may have carried relatively low teaser rates initially, the rates ratcheted up significantly in later years. Such loans threw off much higher income streams to investors who rushed to buy them. Noting this incredible demand for subprime loans, Wall Street happily financed billions and billions of them. These were the liar loans, in which borrowers did not need to supply evidence of jobs or assets. These were the loans that seemed designed to entrap borrowers with punishing prepayment penalties and generating enormous commissions for the entities who wrote and sold them. These were the loans that allowed you to pick your mortgage payment each month, setting up the possibility for a loan where the amount grew over time rather than fell. Such loans were not viewed suspiciously. They were an integral part of the plan to increase homeownership. Still, reckless lenders were not the only ones participating in this debacle. There was a second failure, that of the regulators, and this is far more exasperating. Their inability to spot these run-amok practices before they erupted into a full-fledged foreclosure and economic crisis is simply astonishing. An examination of the regulatory record in the mortgage arena shows abject failure at many critical points along the way. In addition to keeping interest rates too low, Mr. Greenspan's Federal Reserve set the tone for a hands-off approach that permeated all the other federal financial regulators. It infected the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Office of Thrift Supervision, and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, even the Securities and Exchange Commission. Mr. Greenspan was, after all, as we recall, the maestro. A consumer advocate and lawyer in Oakland, California, named Bob Gnezda, told me about a meeting he had with Mr. Greenspan in Washington in the spring of 2004. He warned the maestro of the growing subprime mortgage menace that he saw in low-income areas where he worked. Bob's recollection of what happened at that meeting is instructive. In the hushed, wood-paneled boardroom of the Federal Reserve in Washington, with Mr. Greenspan's staff seated in chairs along the walls, Mr. Gnezda pleaded with the chairman and 6 senior staffers to use his bully pulpit to force the top 10 mortgage originators to set higher lending standards for the industry. We pursued our points with Greenspan, he told me. Then he said what he always said, I don't have the authority to do it. Clearly, this was not true. But his response was characteristic of how, even when danger signs were flashing, officials at most regulatory agencies seemed bent on protecting financial innovation. They recoiled at blocking exotic mortgage products on the grounds that they could increase home ownership in America. It wasn't until June 29th, 2007, for example, that the Fed, the FDIC, the Office of Thrift Supervision, and the Comptroller of the Currency issued a final statement on subprime mortgage lending standards. Among the standards that institutions should follow, quote, to ensure that borrowers obtain loans that they can afford to repay. How very novel, but a bit too late. Delinquency rates were already at 4.85% at this point, and the damage had been done. The FDIC was pretty much alone among its regulatory cohorts in seeing that lending practices had come unglued, but it had to fight its colleagues for changes to the rules that might have helped to prevent the disaster from getting worse. Meanwhile, many of these regulators were socializing with the executives of the entities that they were supposed to oversee, or were gathering at ski or golf resorts for conferences that were sponsored by them. With a few exceptions, the banking industry had completely captured its regulators, allowing the dubious practices to continue and ensuring bankers' profits. This set in motion the events that almost took down the economy. So in addition to chicanery by companies during the mortgage lending spree, we had silence and total disregard from regulators who were charged with overseeing these practices. Throughout the mess, I've watched regulators take a consistent see no evil approach. This meant that they were behind the eight ball not only when the problem was developing, but after it had emerged into public view and gone viral. It was almost as if they thought that if they just pretended it was not the mess that it was, or if they applied a few Band-Aids here and there, the thing would go away. It did not. I guess one of the biggest surprises that struck me as I watched the fiasco unfold was how long it took our nation's policymakers to respond to what was obviously a looming disaster. In January 2007, it was evident even to me that the mortgage mess was going to be bad. And yet policymakers refused to acknowledge this until almost the end of that year. By that time, the disaster was, of course, in full swing and could not be stopped. And so throughout the winter, spring, and even the summer of 2007, the public heard the same denials from Washington. The subprime mortgage problem is contained. The economy is sound. A few ill-conceived mortgages could not possibly cripple our economic engine of growth. Ben Bernanke, Henry Paulson, Timothy Geithner, all were trotted out to bat away any warnings that had been raised by skeptics. Now, I understand that the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board or the Secretary of the Treasury can't alarm people by making public statements about problems that seem to be percolating in the markets. But it is none too confidence-inspiring, in my view, to have top financial officials showing themselves to be so out of the loop. In March 2007, for example, testifying before the Congressional Joint Economic Committee in Washington, Mr. Bernanke said the impact on the broader economy and financial markets of the problems in the subprime market seems likely to be contained. The following month, in April 2007, Mr. Paulson, the Secretary of the Treasury, who had previously run Goldman Sachs, said, "All the signs I look at show the housing market is at or near the bottom." And in May of that year, at a Fed conference in Sea Island, Georgia, Mr. Geithner, now our Treasury Secretary, rhapsodized about how financial innovation had made large banks less vulnerable to shocks than they had been previously. Quote, "The larger global financial institutions are generally stronger in terms of capital relative to risk," he said. Technology and innovation in financial instruments have made it easier for institutions to manage risk. Now, I'm not resurrecting these statements to embarrass these men, but I do think that they help to show the mindset that was at work among top regulatory officials. And when reporters had the temerity to question these statements, they received pretty strong pushback from both the public and the private sector. I think it's critically important to understand whether these officials actually believed their rosy talking points or whether they were taking action behind the scenes to try to forestall disaster. This is not yet clear, and it may never become clear. But documents requested by the New York Times under the Freedom of Information Act support the notion that subprime mortgages were not high on any of these men's priority lists. The documents indicate very little discussion about the subprime mortgage issue among policymakers during the first half of 2007. According to the calendars and schedules of Ben Bernanke, for example, it was not until August 14th of 2007 that the chairman of the Federal Reserve gathered his staff for a meeting to discuss subprime mortgages. And Henry Paulson's schedules indicate that the first discussion of the subprime problem with his staff occurred on September 6th of 2007. If these were indeed the first in-depth discussions about subprime, then the heads of both the Fed and the Treasury were playing a serious game of catch-up. 2 months previously, a couple of Bear Stearns mortgage hedge funds had collapsed, a harbinger of woes to come both at that firm and in the mortgage arena at large. By September 2007, it was no longer feasible to deny that there was a problem in the markets fueled by subprime lending. The commercial paper market, used by companies to fund their short-term operations, had seized up, and the debt markets had started to freeze. Over the next 6 months, regulators floated various proposals and plans to get frozen markets working again, but few got off the ground. None of the proposals, in my view, showed any understanding of just what kind of a storm was brewing. Only when Bear Stearns collapsed in March of 2008 did government officials seem finally to grasp the severity of the situation that they were in. And yet, for all the shock that accompanied that rescue, the government seemed to do nothing about identifying other fault lines in the financial system. 6 precious months elapsed between the Bear Stearns failure and the Lehman collapse, and the documents that I have seen show very little action by the Federal Reserve or the United States Treasury to force banks and brokerage firms to open their books. We know, for instance, that AIG's troubles were escalating that spring, but there does not seem to have been any concerted effort by regulators to identify this and other time bombs, possibly defuse them before they went off. To be sure, the picture that I have from my seat at the New York Times is incomplete. I may be entirely wrong about this period of inaction. Henry Paulson is writing his memoirs. Perhaps he will answer many of the questions I have about what the Treasury was doing during that crucial 6 months between Bear Stearns' failure and the Lehman collapse. Nevertheless, I do believe that that 6-month period of calm after the storm of Bear Stearns was a moment of opportunity that was missed. Then it was a series of chaotic and confused weekends during the summer of 2008. The government first seized Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the mortgage giants that had been deemed adequately capitalized just days before they were taken over. The government pushed Lehman into bankruptcy and bailed out AIG and its major trading partners. A few weeks later, the $700 billion Troubled Asset Relief Program was launched. Looking back at the efforts of this debt, at the effects of this debt binge and purge, I see a two-pronged failure. First was the failure by the private sector to rein itself in or to limit itself to appropriate, defensible business practices. The profits from reckless lending were simply too tantalizing and too titanic for many of the executives running these institutions to pass up. The take the money and run mentality ran amok. But second was the regulatory performance. Given this abysmal record, I find it nothing short of incredible that the Federal Reserve now wants more power to regulate the financial markets. Rewarding gross incompetence with additional regulatory powers just seems so wrong to me. I know that when I mess up, I don't usually get a raise or a promotion. Now, of course, all of us have to pick up the pieces. And unfortunately, the story has moved decisively to Washington, D.C., the land of what I call access journalism. That makes it much harder for me to cover it. One of the reasons I like being a business reporter is that so much of what I need to do my job can be found in the public domain. Corporate financial filings submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission are extremely revealing and do not require access to anything but a computer. By contrast, Washington reporters often must rely upon the kindness of sources to dump documents in their laps. But these disclosures usually come with strings attached, favors that must be returned by the journalist later. I fully understand that I cannot hope to cover my subject in an unbiased fashion if I'm attending their dinner parties or playing tennis with them. But this is de rigueur, I'm afraid, for many Washington reporters. Access journalists can be very dangerous, as we've found out so often. My first obligation to my readers is to my readers, not to friends in high places whose favors I might have to repay. Interestingly, I've found that while many of my peers often try to snare an interview with the most powerful person involved, the chief executive of the company or the chairman of the board, my best tips often come from those who are the most powerless. The little folks much farther down the organization who don't like the activities that they are seeing in their operations, who turn to me because they have gotten no satisfaction from regulators or the companies that they work for. Now, another problem with the nexus of this story moving to Washington is that in spite of President Obama's promise to run an open and transparent government, the people running Treasury are anything but. Earlier this year, for example, the Treasury announced with great fanfare a new program to help prod companies into changing the terms of troubled mortgages to help borrowers stay in their homes. Several months after the program had been in place, my colleagues and I at the paper went back to Treasury to get some figures on exactly how many loans had been modified. We wanted the data because earlier programs had failed, and we wanted to see if this one was succeeding. Well, you would think that we were asking for the secret formula for Coca-Cola. We wrangled, we pestered, we called, we cried, we shrieked. No numbers were forthcoming. Often we would not even get phone calls back. Finally, I think it might have been in June, the numbers started to trickle out. Other documents that have been promised are not seeing the light of day either. The Wall Street Journal reported in late August that a plan by Mr. Geithner to limit lobbyists' influence over the $700 billion bailout program had not yet begun, even though this same program is about to expire. The Special Inspector General overseeing TARP said in a recent report that, quote, inconsistent record keeping makes it impossible to examine the impact of all potential external inquiries on the process of lobbying. When Treasury announced its plan to curb lobbying bailout earlier this year, it said it would publish weekly communication logs showing contacts between public officials and external entities discussing the rescue plans. No such logs have been made available. Again, I don't think it's an accident that documents relating to this fiasco are so difficult to pry out of Washington. The New York Times has had to file suit to receive documents that should have been readily accessible under the Freedom of Information Act. Sometimes when we get these documents, we find them to be hilariously incomplete. We requested copies of Mr. Paulson's calendars going back to January 2007. And after months of wrangling, Treasury sent us what it said were his schedules. Upon examination, we saw page upon page of vacant calendars, days with just one meeting or phone call. We had to go back and make the same request again and sue for the documents. The earlier record was a first calendar. There was, in fact, a second calendar that had many more meetings. Obviously, his days were jam-packed with phone calls to Wall Street firms, especially his former firm, Goldman Sachs. So the idea that this is going to be a transparent administration, unfortunately, has not been borne out in my experience. Of course, I remain hopeful that someone gets the memo in Washington. In his memoirs about the misdeeds that he uncovered during the crash of 1929, Ferdinand Pecora wrote, "Had there been full disclosure of what was being done in furtherance of these schemes, they could not long have survived the fierce light of publicity and criticism. Legal chicanery and pitch darkness were the bankers' stoutest allies." That sounds very familiar to me. And until we get the complete picture of what our government was doing in the period leading up to this debacle and in its aftermath, we will not be able to know how to prevent such a disaster from recurring. Now, those are my prepared remarks. I'd be very happy to take questions from the floor if there are any. Thank you very much. You're the master of the mic. Is that a hand up? Okay.
Have you had the opportunity to look into the commercial real estate bubble that I've heard is sitting out there and waiting to explode like next year into 2011?
The question was, have I looked into the commercial real estate bubble that is waiting to explode later this year and in 2011? Commercial real estate is, yes, a lagging debacle. I mean, the residential mortgages really was what caved in first, as we know. There are two more legs to this problem, to this debt binge, that we have yet to really see the full effect of. One is commercial real estate. The other is consumer lending, credit cards, student loans, things like that. But commercial real estate is very, very worrisome. I think Ben Bernanke, in a moment of candor, actually mentioned the fact that he was worried about it. So it must be really ugly if he's actually acknowledging that it's a problem. We see it in New York, of course, because there was such a private equity firms were dealing in this in commercial real estate so aggressively. They were, with low-cost money, able to buy enormous properties and, hope to throw out existing tenants if they were residential properties, raise the rents, and then make the number, because they really spent so much more than they should have that it was really never going to be, economically viable for them unless they were able to throw out these tenants. But yes, I think that we are still in the midst of the commercial real estate downturn. It is perhaps maybe not going to be as troubling to work out as the residential mortgage problem, I think, because these loans, these residential loans that were packaged into pools have to be worked out loan by loan. Whereas if you have a commercial property, a big high-rise or a big residential development, you can package that security, that real estate, sell it to someone else en masse. Whereas residential, it's really loan by loan by loan by loan, and that is why this thing seems to drag on forever as far as the residential mortgage problem is concerned. Uh-huh.
Do you have any insightful views when it comes to your with Wagner talking about tax?
I love these conspiracy theorists. As a kind of an investigative reporter, I'm always looking for conspiracies. It's hard to, you could maybe make the argument that there was more interaction than was probably kosher or than was probably smart, than was wise. I mean, we did a couple of stories about the contacts that Mr. Paulson had with Lloyd Blankfein, his counterpart at Goldman Sachs. And I know that what I was trying to do was to, when I was reporting this story, was to make sure that I wasn't inferring anything, incorrect, or that I wasn't making a mountain out of a molehill when he was on the phone with him constantly. And so I went to people that I trust who are really impeccable backgrounds, really not in any way corrupted by any kind of, scandal or anything. And I said they had both worked in the private sector and in Washington. And I said, how would you feel about this if you knew that the Treasury Secretary was on the phone with his replacement at Goldman Sachs when the world is coming, melting down, and Goldman Sachs, by the way, is receiving, $13 billion from the taxpayers when AIG gets bailed out? How would you feel about that? And to a person, all of these people said, it just doesn't pass the smell test. And had it been me, they all said, I would have had a lieutenant do it. I would have had someone else make the calls. Because even if what they were doing was perfectly above board, it doesn't look good. And so when you get into a situation where the perception of the problem becomes the problem, that's almost as bad as if you have the conversation saying, oh, you've got to save Goldman Sachs because it's your old firm, which no one, of course, has. So, of course, I wasn't there. It was a crisis period. Of course, you're going to have to say that it was an incredibly bewildering, frightening moment. The economy did seem terribly imperiled. Maybe you just cut these guys some slack and say, okay, the world didn't end, and whatever you had to do, you did it. But it's unfortunate that it has left this taste in many people's mouths that Goldman Sachs gets special treatment, or big firms on Wall Street get special treatment, and the little people have to play by different rules. Uh-huh.
You explained really well why the crisis happened, but I still don't understand why it happened. Is that a problem with Wall Street and how they're dealing with debt? Or is that something to do with housing market? Explain why the crash was so bad, how we get out of it. Why couldn't you think that it was carried forever?
Well, the question is, why did the housing bubble burst? Why didn't it go on forever? If you're a student of markets, you know that, whenever there is a mania, it goes on for far longer than anybody predicts that it will, even as people are, calling it a mania, excuse me, calling it a bubble. It climbs the wall of worry, as they say. But nothing goes up forever, and there is a moment, and whether it's a collective moment, like 1987, when the stock market fell 500 points in one day, there is a moment when there's a recognition by all the people who are speculating and playing this game to try to sell to the greater fool that's going to come down the road, right, and buy my house for way more than it's worth. There's a recognition that I think it's time for me to get out. I think it's time to leave the party. I'm getting a little nervous, maybe, maybe it's I mean, it wasn't because they raised interest rates. It wasn't because, it had engorged itself to the max, and it couldn't, it's hard to explain this, but markets are emotional things because they're driven by people, and people are emotional. And so there's a moment in time, and you can never predict it or pinpoint it until after the fact, that it becomes, I'm leaving this party before my head is handed to me on a platter. And, why that happened in 2007, why that happened in, the end of 2006, I think that there were some investors who started to see that the loans that were in some of these pools were, to people with FICO scores that were barely, in the 3 digits, to people who had no assets, no job. People were starting to examine some of the loans in the pools, and they were saying, no, thank you. It became a little bit harder to sell. Some of the big banks that had, Citigroup, for instance, that had a huge business securitizing mortgages and selling them to investors, started to have trouble. Investors were starting to say, I got enough of that. I don't really need any more of that. I think I'll buy some treasuries instead. So then those ended up, all of those billions of dollars of securities that Citigroup had put together wound up sitting on their balance sheet, which is why they had to be bailed out to the tune of, $45 billion and then $300 billion in insurance. So it's hard to know what was the thing, what was the straw that broke the camel's back. I can't tell you, but it is an emotional thing, these markets and how they behave. And why does oil go to where it goes? And why does the Dow Jones go to where it's one of those life mysteries. I would love anyone to help me to explain it. If there's someone here who can tell me, I'm sure there is, but I just can't.